I want to pay a tribute to a good friend of mine, brother Elvis Presley, who opened up a lot of doors.
The crown was heavy, but the copper coffin was heavier. In the suffocating August heat, the world stopped. Elvis Presley was dead. Millions choked the streets outside Graceland, drowning in grief. But under the cover of darkness, the back gates swung open for one man. James Brown stepped into the absolute silence of the mansion. He walked to the casket alone. For hours, the Godfather of Soul stared at his fiercest rival. Then, he whispered a shattering confession. It was a secret statement that would split the music industry wide open. Critics wanted him to call the king a thief. What James Brown said instead defied the entire world, and nobody saw it coming. Two kings, one concrete ground. The music industry loves a clean fight. It wants a clear winner and a clear loser. For decades, the public bought into the ultimate musical Cold War. In one corner stood Elvis Presley, the white country boy from Mississippi. In the other stood James Brown, the explosive pioneer of funk from South Carolina. The media painted them as natural enemies. One supposedly stole the rhythm, while the other fought to reclaim it. But the history books missed the most important part of the story. The bitter rivalry was a complete fabrication. It was a marketing trick that hid a dangerous secret alliance. Go back to the very beginning. Look at the mud and the wood of the deep American South in 1935. Elvis was born in a two-room shack in Tupelo. 2 years earlier, James Brown entered the world in a small wooden cabin in the pine woods of Barnwell. Both families had absolutely nothing. They didn't have running water. They didn't have guaranteed meals. The only thing they truly owned was the air in their lungs. How did two boys from the exact same dirt end up on opposite sides of a cultural war? The answer lies in the segregation of the radio dial. As young boys, they both found their escape in the exact same place. They walked into the loud, sweat-soaked tents of the Pentecostal church. This wasn't the quiet, polite religion of the upper classes. This was foot-stomping, hand-clapping gospel. Elvis sat in the back of the Assembly of God church, watching the preacher shake and throw his hands to the sky. James Brown sat in the wooden pews of the spiritualist churches, watching the elders fall to their knees in a trance. Both boys took mental notes. They learned that music wasn't just something you listened to. It was something that possessed your entire body. They watched the preachers command the room. They saw how a single vocal run could make an entire room scream. They didn't just learn how to sing, they learned how to control an audience. By 1956, the trap was set. Elvis walked into Sun's studio and shook his hips on national television. The white public went wild, but the black press looked on with deep suspicion. At the exact same time, James Brown released his first major hit with the famous Flames. The song was called Please, Please, Please. It was a raw, begging blues track that sounded like a man tearing his own heart out on stage. The record companies saw an opportunity to make millions. They knew that friction sells records. The media immediately began to build a massive wall between the two young stars. They told the public that Elvis was the king of the white mainstream. They labeled James Brown as the underground hero of the black chitlin circuit. On paper, they were total opposites. Elvis wore polished velvet and sang to screaming teenagers on television. James Brown performed 300 nights a year in smoky, dangerous clubs, sweating through 5 shirts a night. But what happened when the cameras stopped rolling? Did they actually hate each other? The public thought so. The fans picked sides. You were either a rock and roll fan or a rhythm and blues fan. You couldn't be both. The teenage magazines printed fake stories about backstage arguments. They fabricated quotes about stolen dance moves. The tension was good for business, so nobody bothered to correct the record. Both camps stayed completely silent. The truth came out in 1966. James Brown was scheduled to play a massive show in California. He was dealing with intense pressure from civil rights groups to take a radical political stance. He was exhausted. He was lonely. The weight of his own community was resting squarely on his shoulders. He didn't know who to trust. Suddenly, an expensive limousine pulled up to the backstage entrance of the venue. The security guards went completely still. A massive wooden crate was lifted out of the vehicle. It was not a bomb, and it was not a legal threat. It was a personal gift from Elvis Presley. Inside the crate was a collection of rare, private recordings and a handwritten note of encouragement. Elvis wrote about the loneliness of the stage. He wrote about the people who try to pull you down when you reach the top. He told James to keep pushing. That single gesture shattered the illusion of the rivalry. Elvis didn't view James as a threat to his crown. He viewed him as a brother in arms. They were the only two performers in America who knew the true cost of that level of fame. They couldn't walk down a normal street. They couldn't trust the managers who handled their money. They were surrounded by yes men who smiled while stealing from their pockets. When Elvis looked at James Brown, he didn't see an enemy. He saw the only other man who understood the suffocating weight of an empire. But why did Elvis choose this exact moment to reach out? What did he know about James Brown's internal struggles? Elvis had his own spies in the industry. He knew that the record executives were trying to trap James Brown in an unfair contract. He knew how it felt to be owned by a corporation. The gift was a secret signal. It was proof that the walls built by the media were completely hollow. The public remained completely blind to this connection. The press kept writing articles about the clash of the titans. Radio stations refused to play their songs back to back. The world demanded a war between the White King and the Black Godfather, but the foundation of that war was already crumbling from the inside out. They were writing a secret history in the dark, away from the screaming fans and the flashing cameras. The secrets of the 7-year itch. The stage became a golden cage. By the late 1960s, the roaring crowds outside couldn't save Elvis Presley from the absolute isolation inside his own life. He locked himself away in hotel penthouses, deep behind the stone walls of Graceland. He was surrounded by a wall of bodyguards. On the other side of the country, James Brown was running his own grueling marathon. He was constantly fighting the tax collectors, handling internal band mutinies, and facing pure physical exhaustion. They were both running out of gas. Then came the year 1969. Elvis walked onto the stage at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. He wore a heavy, jewel-encrusted jumpsuit. He looked out at the wealthy, diamond-wearing crowd. It was a massive financial success, but he felt like a circus act. That exact same month, James Brown was sitting in a tiny, dimly lit dressing room in Atlanta. His shirt was soaked through with sweat. His feet were bleeding from his heavy leather boots. He had just performed 2 high-energy shows back to back. They both realized something terrifying at the exact same time. The music industry didn't care about their health. The industry only cared about the money they generated. They began exchanging private messages through trusted couriers, no long letters. Just short, urgent notes passed through security guards and drivers. They used a codename system to keep the press from catching on. If a reporter saw a member of James Brown's crew walking into Elvis's hotel suite, it would cause a national media scandal. What did these secret notes actually say? Did they talk about their music, or did they talk about their survival? The notes were simple. They talked about the sleeping pills. They talked about the crooked managers who were altering the financial ledgers. Elvis sent James the name of a private doctor who could be trusted. James sent Elvis a warning about a specific promoter who was known for stealing cash from the box office. Elvis did something the public never knew about. He used his massive industry leverage to push James Brown's music into venues that were historically locked tight to black artists. He made a direct phone call to a major venue owner in Las Vegas. He demanded that they give James Brown a primetime slot. The venue owner hesitated, citing the segregation of the local clientele. Elvis threatened to pull his own residency if they didn't comply. The venue owner gave in. James Brown got his booking. It was a silent victory born from a secret pact. But the pressure kept building. By 1972, Elvis's physical health was completely failing. His weight was fluctuating wildly. He was taking a dangerous cocktail of prescription medication just to get through a 90-minute set. He would collapse into a chair the second he hit the wings of the stage. James Brown was facing a different kind of nightmare. The Internal Revenue Service was auditing his entire empire. They claimed he owed millions of dollars in back taxes. His band members walked out on him right before a major European tour because they hadn't been paid on time. They were 2 sinking ships in the exact same storm. In the winter of 1973, James Brown made a quiet visit to Las Vegas. He didn't book a hotel under his own name. He slipped through the service elevator of the Hilton and walked into Elvis's private suite. The room was completely dark. The windows were covered with thick black aluminum foil to keep the daylight out. Elvis was sitting in a large armchair, watching a television with the sound turned completely off. They sat together for 3 hours. They didn't play any instruments. They didn't sing a single note of gospel music. They just talked about the dirt roads of their childhood. They talked about the mothers they missed. They talked about the fact that they were completely alone in the world, despite having millions of fans screaming their names outside the building. Elvis gave James a heavy gold ring right before he left the room. It was a personal token of their alliance. The public remained totally clueless. The radio stations kept playing the hits. The fans kept buying the posters. The media kept writing articles about how rock and roll had completely destroyed the rhythm and blues market. The world demanded a war between the White King and the Black Godfather. But the two men at the top were holding on to each other like a lifeline. They knew that if one of them fell, the other wouldn't be very far behind. The fire in the testimony. The phone call woke James Brown up at his home in Georgia. It was August 16, 1977. The voice on the other end was frantic. Elvis Presley was dead. The news hit the Godfather of Soul like a physical blow. He didn't call his manager. He didn't draft a public press release. He walked straight to his closet, pulled out a black suit, and told his driver to head for Memphis. When he arrived at the gates of Graceland, the scene was pure chaos. Tens of thousands of people blocked the boulevards. They were weeping, screaming, and clutching old vinyl records. The security guards spotted James Brown's car. The massive iron gate swung open just wide enough for his vehicle to slip through. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, had left specific instructions. He wanted James inside. He was escorted into the absolute quiet of the mansion. The family led him down the hall to the room where the copper coffin sat under heavy drapery. They cleared the room. They left the Godfather of Soul completely alone with the king. James Brown walked slowly to the edge of the casket. He looked down at the face of his friend. He didn't see a rival. He saw a brother who had finally escaped the machine. For hours he stayed in that room, whispering things only the dead could hear. When he finally stepped outside, the reporters rushed him. They jammed microphones into his face. They wanted a soundbite. They wanted him to say something dramatic about the end of rock and roll. James Brown looked past the cameras. He told the press that he had lost his closest brother, and then he got back into his car. Years passed, and the cultural landscape began to shift dramatically. The late 1970s turned into the 1980s. The conversation around music history became highly political. Scholars and critics started re-examining the origins of rock and roll through a harsh lens. They looked at Elvis Presley's legacy, and they labeled him a thief. They accused him of taking black music, diluting it for a white audience, and leaving the original creators in the dirt. The television networks wanted to capitalize on this anger. A major production crew booked an interview with James Brown. They expected him to lead the charge against the king. He was, after all, the architect of funk and a symbol of black pride. How would the Godfather of Soul respond to the allegations against his old friend? Would he join the critics, or would he stand alone? The interview took place under bright studio lights. The journalist leaned forward and asked the definitive question. He asked James Brown if Elvis had stolen his style and his music from the black community. The studio crew went dead silent. They waited for the explosion. James Brown didn't hesitate. He fixed his eyes directly on the lens of the main camera. His voice was low, sharp, and entirely steady. He told the interviewer that they were completely wrong. He didn't just defend Elvis. He dropped a bombshell that left the producers speechless. He said that Elvis Presley didn't steal a single thing. He said that Elvis was the man who opened the door for every single black artist in America, including James Brown himself. He told the reporter that before Elvis shook up the airwaves, black music was completely trapped behind regional segregation lines. White teenagers weren't allowed to buy it. Mainstream stations wouldn't play it. Elvis broke that barrier down with a sledgehammer. By playing that rhythm on national television, he forced the entire world to look at the roots of the music. The journalist tried to push back. He brought up the money. He brought up the fact that Elvis made millions while the blues pioneers died in poverty. James Brown cut him off instantly. He said that the financial exploitation was the fault of the record companies, not the man in the jumpsuit. He revealed that Elvis had used his own wealth to quietly support older musicians who were struggling to pay their medical bills. He had done it without telling the press. He had done it out of pure respect. The interview ended early. The producers didn't get the sensational headline they wanted. They wanted a story of racial betrayal and artistic theft. Instead, they got a fierce testament of loyalty. The tape was broadcast to millions of homes. The reaction was immediate. A large segment of the public was stunned. Some civil rights activists were furious with James Brown. They felt he was protecting a white icon at the expense of his own people's history. But James Brown refused to walk back a single word of his testimony. He didn't care about the backlash, and he didn't care about the opinion pieces in the magazines. He knew the truth because he had lived it. He had sat in the dark rooms with Elvis. He had seen the scars on the king's hands from holding onto a crown that was burning him alive. They were two boys from the same southern soil, and no amount of media spin could rewrite the bond they formed in the shadows. The legacy of brothers. The telephone inside James Brown's Augusta office did not stop ringing for 3 days straight. It was 1981. The broadcast of his television interview had sent shockwaves straight through the entertainment industry. Activists called his private line. Fellow musicians left angry messages with his secretary. They wanted an explanation. They wanted to know why the pioneer of Black pride was spending his public capital defending a deceased white icon. James Brown sat at his mahogany desk and listened to the complaints. He did not blink. He did not draft a retraction. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. He booked a flight to Memphis. He went back to the source of the noise. He chose to answer his critics not with a press release, but with a highly public display of presence. He walked right through the main entrance of Graceland in broad daylight. The fans outside stared in disbelief. This was a moment of immense political friction. The Black Power movement and the traditional music establishment were locked in a fierce debate over cultural ownership. By standing on Elvis's front porch, James Brown was choosing a side in a war that most people thought he should be fighting from the opposite trench. Why would a man who wrote the anthems of Black liberation risk his entire cultural standing for a ghost? The answers were written in the ledger books of his own career. James Brown remembered the year 1962. He had tried to record a live album at the Apollo Theater. His record label, King Records, had flatly refused to fund the project. They told him a live album of rhythm and blues would not sell to the mainstream. James had to dig into his own pockets and spend his last dollar to record that show himself. When the album became a massive, multi-million selling success, the executive rooms in New York suddenly changed their tune. But James never forgot who had softened those rooms up in the first place. It was Elvis, breaking the radio formats a decade earlier, who proved that raw, unpolished energy was commercial gold. The critics did not want to hear about industry mechanics. They wanted an ideological victory. A prominent Black radio disc jockey publicly accused James Brown of turning his back on the struggle. He called for a boycott of Brown's latest singles. The pressure was immense. Most artists would have blinked. They would have claimed the interview was edited out of context. James Brown did the opposite. He invited the hostile disc jockey directly to his dressing room before a concert in Atlanta. He did not hire security to keep him out. He sat him down in a folding chair right next to his wardrobe trunks. He pulled a heavy worn piece of jewelry out of his pocket. It was the gold ring Elvis had given him in that dark Las Vegas hotel suite years earlier. He dropped it into the palm of the critic's hand. He asked the man if he had ever had to perform a show while federal agents sat in the box office counting the ticket receipts. He asked if he had ever been banned from staying in the very hotels where his name was printed on the marquee. The critic stayed silent. James Brown told him that Elvis had faced those exact same hounds. He explained that the corporate machinery of the music business chewed up anyone who dared to change the status quo, regardless of the color of their skin. He said that when you are fighting an army that large, you do not shoot at your own allies. The boycott dissolved within a week. The disc jockey went back on the air and played James Brown's records back to back with old Sun Records tracks. But the mainstream media was still looking for a crack in the armor. They sent an investigative reporter to track down the financial receipts of Elvis's estate. They wanted to prove that the King's charity toward Black artists was just a myth created by James Brown to justify their friendship. What did the financial records actually reveal? Did they show a pattern of genuine support, or was it all a carefully constructed illusion? The reporter found exactly what James Brown had promised. In the private accounts of the Presley estate, there were dozens of canceled checks from the late 1960s and early 70s. They were made out to aging, forgotten blues singers who had been cheated out of their royalties by early record contracts. There were receipts for medical bills paid in full. There were monthly allowances sent to widows of Southern musicians. None of these acts had ever been turned into a press release. Elvis had ordered his accountant to keep the ledger books completely private. He did not want the praise of the magazines. He just wanted to settle a debt of honor. James Brown watched the media reports drop one by one. Each finding verified the words he had spoken under the hot studio lights. He did not gloat. He did not call a press conference to say he told them so. He simply went back to the studio and kept working on his own music. He had a tour to run. He had his own kingdom to maintain. The public finally began to understand that this was not a story of compromise. It was a story of ultimate authority. James Brown did not need permission from his critics to decide who his brothers were. He had earned his crown through sweat, blood, and 300 nights a year on the road. If he said Elvis Presley was his brother, then the debate was officially over. They were two separate forces of nature that had completely redesigned the map of American life. The world tried to categorize them. The system tried to turn them into weapons to be used against each other. But they had bypassed the entire trap by simply looking each other in the eye and recognizing the shared fire of the Southern dirt. The final silence. The needle dropped on a piece of heavy black vinyl in a small radio booth in Atlanta. It was December 26th, 2006. The morning air was freezing. The disc jockey looked down at his console with tears in his eyes. A piece of breaking news had just flashed across his computer screen. James Brown, the Godfather of Soul, was dead at 73 years old. He had passed away on Christmas Day. The disc jockey didn't play a current pop hit. He didn't air a long commercial break. He reached into the station's archive vault and pulled out a rare, dusty bootleg recording. It wasn't a standard funk track. It wasn't a recording of a massive stadium concert. It was a private tape from 1974, capturing James Brown singing a slow, stripped-down version of an old gospel hymn. The booth went completely silent as the track played. For decades, music commentators had tried to force James Brown and Elvis Presley into separate drawers of history. They wanted a story of complete division. They insisted on a clean timeline where one world never touched the other. But the master tapes from that era told a completely different story. What did the recording engineers discover when they went back into the studio vaults after both men were gone? The engineers found something remarkable in the master tracks from the early 1970s. During a late-night session at Stax Studios, James Brown had kept his backing band in the room until 4 o'clock in the morning. They weren't working on a new single. They were recording a series of rhythm tracks, specifically designed to fit Elvis Presley's vocal range. James Brown had planned to send the tapes to Graceland as a surprise gift for a collaborative album. The project never happened because the corporate lawyers intervened. The two record labels threatened legal action over contract exclusivity. They locked the tapes in a vault, away from the ears of the public. The business people wanted a wall between the White King and the Black Godfather. The friction generated millions of dollars in magazine sales. But the two men at the peak of the mountain refused to play the game. Look at the physical items they left behind. When the executors of James Brown's estate opened his private safe in Georgia, they didn't just find gold records and cash. They found a small, velvet-lined box. Inside was a collection of personal photographs. One picture showed Elvis and James standing backstage in 1966, laughing with their arms slung around each other's shoulders. Their stage capes were hanging on the wall behind them. The image had never been published in a single newspaper. It had never been used to promote a concert tour. It was kept private because its value wasn't commercial. It was a testament to a quiet, unbroken brotherhood. The music historians still write books about the great division of American pop music. They analyze the radio charts from 1956 to 1977. They count the record sales and they debate the cultural ownership of the rhythm. They try to make the history look like a courtroom battle with a clear winner and a clear loser. The fans still split into separate camps on internet forums and in collectors' shops. They argue over who built the foundation of modern music. They claim that you have to choose between the country boy from Tupelo and the funk pioneer from Barnwell. But the entire debate dissolves the moment you listen to the music with open ears. Listen to the way Elvis pushed his voice to the absolute limit of its register during his final concert tours. Listen to the way James Brown dropped his weight into the groove during his legendary performances at the Apollo Theater. The DNA of their music is completely intertwined. They both took the raw, shouting energy of the Southern tents and used it to change the world. They paid a massive price for their respective crowns. They lived their lives inside armored limousines and behind security fences. They were surrounded by people who viewed them as financial machines rather than human beings. In the end, they were the only two men who truly understood the absolute loneliness of that position. The public never saw the full picture because the industry wasn't built to handle the truth. It was built to sell a rivalry. But the final verdict wasn't delivered by the critics or the record companies. It was delivered by James Brown himself on that hot afternoon at Graceland, and later under the bright lights of the television studio. He set the record straight for anyone who cared to listen. The echo of the last note. A heavy iron vault door swung open in downtown Nashville. The year was 2024, and a team of archival preservationists stepped inside. They were cataloging old magnetic tapes that had sat untouched for decades. One engineer pulled a dusty cardboard box off the bottom shelf. The label on the box simply read, Presley Brown Sessions, 1974. The team placed the 2-inch tape onto a reel-to-reel machine. They pressed play. The sound that filled the room wasn't a standard, polished radio hit. It was a raw, unedited studio track. You could hear the clear, distinct sound of a Hammond organ warming up. Then, a voice cut through the static. It was James Brown, directing his horn section in a sharp, syncopated rhythm. A few seconds later, a deep baritone laugh echoed through the studio microphone. It was Elvis. The tape machine kept spinning, revealing a piece of history that the public had been told never existed. Why had this tape remained buried in a dark vault for over 50 years? Why did the world believe they never shared a studio microphone? The answer came down to a fierce legal battle over contract exclusivity. In 1974, Elvis Presley was signed to RCA Records. James Brown was locked into a strict deal with Polydor. The two corporations viewed their star artists as intellectual property. The moment the executives found out about the midnight session in Nashville, the phone lines lit up with legal threats. Cease and desist letters were sent to both camps by noon the next day. The master tapes were confiscated, locked in an iron box, and buried in the corporate archives. The record companies wanted to keep the walls up. They needed the public to keep buying the narrative of the white rock icon and the black funk pioneer. If the world knew they were actively creating music together, the manufactured marketing division would fall apart completely. But you cannot lock a creative movement in a vault forever. Decades later, the physical artifacts left behind by both men tell the true story. Walk into the private archive rooms at Graceland today. Look past the glittering stage capes and the gold-plated Cadillacs. In a small display case sits a customized leather touring jacket. The embroidery on the back features a stylized lightning bolt. It was a personal gift from James Brown, delivered to Elvis right before his final tour. Elvis wore that jacket during his private rehearsals away from the cameras. He didn't wear it for publicity. He wore it because it came from the only other man who knew the absolute exhaustion of the road. The music historians still publish thick textbooks about the great cultural divide of the 20th century. They draw charts. They analyze the radio playlists. They try to turn music into a mathematical equation with separate, isolated variables. The fans still spend hours arguing on digital forums. They claim you have to pick a side. They tell you that you cannot love the country boy from Mississippi if you respect the funk pioneer from South Carolina. But the arguments stop the moment the music starts. Listen to the live recordings of Elvis Presley from his late Las Vegas period. Listen to the way he commands his rhythm section to drop the bass out of the mix. That isn't country music. That is the exact same arrangement style that James Brown used to build his funk empire. Now, listen to James Brown's late career ballads. Listen to the deep, gospel-infused vibrato in his lower register. He was using the exact same vocal phrasing that he had watched Elvis use in the Pentecostal tents during their youth. They were constantly feeding off each other's energy. They didn't need a corporate contract to validate their connection. They had a shared vocabulary that bypassed the entire music industry. They both paid the ultimate price for their positions. They died on holidays. Elvis in the sweltering heat of August, James on a freezing Christmas day. They left behind millions of grieving fans, mountain loads of cash, and a complicated web of legal battles. But they also left behind a truth that no corporate executive could erase. The final verdict didn't belong to the critics who labeled Elvis a thief. It didn't belong to the radio programmers who tried to segregate the airwaves. It belonged to the two men who stood at the absolute peak of the mountain and reached out to each other in the dark. Two separate thrones, one unbroken Southern dirt, and a secret brotherhood that the world was never supposed to find out about. The music stopped, but the footprint remains. Elvis Presley and James Brown didn't just survive the cutthroat industry, they secretly anchored each other through it. They proved that true artistry cannot be segregated, managed, or kept in a cage. Their hidden alliance permanently rewrote the rules of American